History is often presented as a solved thing. Dates fixed, causes identified, outcomes explained. But that confidence rests on what survives: documents, artifacts, testimony. And sometimes, those foundations simply fall away. Records stop. Evidence contradicts itself. Events unfold that refuse to settle into a single explanation. This video explores 4 such moments. They are not myths. They are not legends. They are events that genuinely occurred, and yet, even centuries later, still resist full understanding. These cases are presented in order, with each one becoming progressively more difficult to explain. The final case is the most unresolved of them all. The Lost Colony of Roanoke. In the late 16th century, people in England were beginning to leave home and sail west across the Atlantic. Spain controlled much of the known world beyond Europe. English ships followed Spanish trade routes, searching for places to settle, trade, and stake a claim of their own. The idea of a permanent English colony had been discussed for years. By the 1580s, it was finally attempted. In the summer of 1587, a small group of ships left England carrying more than 100 people. Men, women, and children. Families, craftsmen, labourers. They were not soldiers on campaign, and they were not explorers planning to return home. They were settlers. Their destination was Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. It was remote, low-lying, and surrounded by water and marshland. It had been chosen not because it was ideal, but because it was available. From the beginning, the settlement struggled. Food was limited, the soil was poor, fresh water was unreliable. The colonists depended entirely on ships returning from England with supplies. Without regular resupply, the colony could not survive. Before the year was out, it was clear that help was needed. John White, the colony's governor, agreed to return to England to gather food, tools, and reinforcements. He left behind the entire settlement, including his own daughter and his young granddaughter, expecting to return within a few months. He did not know it would be nearly 3 years. Soon after White reached England, events overtook him. Spain was preparing to invade. The Spanish Armada threatened England's coast. Ships were seized for defense. Civilian crossings were suspended. No one was allowed to sail west. White waited. Months passed. Winter came and went. The colony waited without him. White pleaded for permission to return. When he finally secured a ship, storms forced it back. Another attempt failed. Each delay meant more time passed with no word from Roanoke. By the time White was finally able to sail again, nearly 3 years had gone by. In August of 1590, his ship approached the coast of Roanoke Island. As they drew closer, there was no smoke rising from the settlement. No movement on the shore. No signs that anyone was waiting. When they landed, the island was silent. The settlement was still there, but no one lived in it. Houses stood empty. Wooden structures had been taken apart. Defensive barriers were gone. Nothing had been burned. Nothing had been smashed. It did not look like a place abandoned in panic. There were no bodies, no graves, no signs of fighting. The people were simply gone. As White searched the site, he found a word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. Nearby, the letters CRO had been cut into the bark of a tree. Before leaving England, White had given the settlers clear instructions. If they chose to relocate, they were to carve the name of their destination. If they were forced to leave under threat, they were to carve a cross alongside it. There was no cross. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island. It was also the name of a local group the settlers knew. White believed the message was deliberate. He wanted to search for them, but the weather turned. Storms damaged the ship. Supplies ran low. The crew refused to continue. Against his will, White was forced to abandon the search and return to England. He would never see the settlers again. In the years that followed, no confirmed record of the Roanoke colonists was ever found. Later, English explorers heard rumors of people living inland who spoke some English or who possessed European tools. None of these accounts could be verified. Centuries later, small pieces of evidence began to surface. European objects discovered far from the coast, tools that suggested movement inland, away from Roanoke. They did not explain what happened. They did not explain how many survived. They did not explain how long. The settlers of Roanoke did not disappear in a single moment. They made choices under pressure, with limited options, and then lived or failed beyond the edge of the historical record. They waited. They moved. And eventually, they stopped leaving traces. By the time anyone returned to look for them, history had already arrived too late. The Dancing Plague of 1518. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was already under strain. The heat was heavy. The streets were narrow and crowded. Food had been scarce for years, and many people were undernourished. Disease was common. Contemporary records describe a population worn down by repeated famine and illness. Strasbourg lay along the Rhine, busy and noisy, its houses pressed tightly together. People lived close enough to hear one another through the walls. According to city chronicles, one morning in July, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped out of her home and into the street. Without music, without ceremony, she began to dance. At first, those who saw her thought it was strange, but harmless. The movements were awkward and irregular, as if driven by compulsion rather than joy. She danced for hours. When night came, she did not stop. By morning, she was still moving. Accounts written at the time describe her feet swelling, her body shaking with exhaustion. Eventually, she collapsed. After resting briefly, she stood up and began again. Within days, others joined her. City records note men and women entering the streets and beginning to dance in the same uncontrolled way. Some cried as they moved. Some shouted. Some begged to be restrained. They could not stop themselves. The number of dancers grew steadily. A handful became dozens, dozens became scores. By the end of the first week, eyewitnesses described streets filled with people twisting, stumbling, and collapsing. Some danced until their shoes fell apart, others until their feet bled. The city council was alarmed, but uncertain how to respond. Physicians were consulted. Their opinion, recorded in official documents, was that the dancers were suffering from an excess of heat in the blood. According to medical thinking at the time, the proper treatment was movement. The city acted on this advice. A wooden stage was erected in the marketplace. Musicians were hired at public expense. The dancers were encouraged to continue, in the belief that the condition would pass once it had run its course. Instead, the situation worsened. More people joined. Contemporary sources describe individuals dancing for days without rest. Some collapsed and did not rise again. Deaths were attributed to strokes, heart failure, and exhaustion. As fear spread, the authorities reversed their approach. Music was banned. Dancing was forbidden. Those affected were removed from the city and taken to nearby shrines, where prayers and rituals were performed in the hope of relief. Gradually, the dancing subsided. After several weeks, it ended. Those who survived returned to their lives. Those who did not were buried. The city records fall silent. What they do not contain is an explanation. No account describes a single cause. No document records a moment when the dancing was chosen or understood. The people who danced left no testimony explaining what they felt, only descriptions of pain, compulsion, and exhaustion. In the centuries since, historians have returned to the event. Some have suggested ergot poisoning, a fungus that can grow on rye and cause convulsions and hallucinations. But ergot poisoning does not persist for weeks, and it does not spread through sight or suggestion alone. Others, including modern historians drawing on contemporary accounts, have argued that the episode reflects a form of collective psychological distress. Strasbourg had endured repeated famine, disease, and social pressure. The population lived under constant strain, with few means of relief. That explanation fits much of the evidence. But it does not account for everything. It does not explain the duration, or the physical endurance displayed, or why the behavior took this specific form. The records are detailed, the deaths are documented, the spread is consistent across multiple sources. Yet no explanation fully settles. What remains is a moment carefully recorded by those who witnessed it, and still not fully understood by those who study it. The Antikythera Mechanism. In the spring of 1900, a group of sponge divers set out from the Greek island of Symi. They were looking for sponge beds along the coast, diving deep without modern equipment, heavy suits, copper helmets, air pumped down through long hoses. A storm forced them off course. Seeking shelter, they anchored near a small rocky island called Antikythera, between Crete and the mainland of Greece. While waiting for the weather to clear, one of the divers descended to the seabed. When he surfaced, he was shaken. He said the sea floor was littered with bodies. At first, the others thought he was delirious, but when more divers went down, they understood what he had seen. The bodies were statues. Bronze and marble figures lay scattered across the wreck of an ancient ship. Horses, gods, human forms frozen in motion, the remains of a vessel that had sunk more than 2,000 years earlier. Over the following months, the wreck was carefully salvaged. Statues were hauled to the surface, amphorae, coins, fragments of wood and metal. Among the objects recovered was a small, corroded lump of bronze. It drew little attention. The statues were displayed in museums. Scholars debated their origins. The bronze lump was catalogued and set aside. Years passed. Then, as the object dried and cracked, something unexpected appeared. Inside the corrosion were teeth. Gear teeth. At first, it was difficult to believe. Precision gears were not supposed to exist in the ancient world, not at this scale, not with this level of complexity. Early researchers struggled to understand what they were looking at. The object was fragmented, much of it was missing. The surfaces were obscured by centuries of corrosion. For decades, it remained an enigma. Then, in the second half of the 20th century, new tools became available. X-rays were taken. Later, more advanced imaging revealed hidden layers inside the fragments. Inscriptions emerged, tiny, carefully engraved letters, barely visible to the naked eye. Researchers began to realize that the gears were not decorative, they were functional. The teeth were arranged in deliberate ratios. Some gears turned others at precise intervals. Dials and pointers could be reconstructed from surviving pieces. Slowly, a picture formed. The device had been designed to track cycles in the sky. It could model the movement of the sun and moon. It could predict eclipses. It aligned lunar months with solar years using known astronomical cycles. Some reconstructions suggest it may even have accounted for the motion of planets. All of this was done mechanically. No electronics. No glass lenses. Just bronze gears, cut with care. The dates suggested by the inscriptions place its construction around the 1st century BCE. Nothing like it was known to exist from that period. What made the discovery more unsettling was not only what the mechanism could do, but what followed. There is no clear record of who built it. No surviving text describes its construction. No other complete example has ever been found. The knowledge required to design it did not disappear overnight. It must have existed among skilled craftsmen and astronomers. And yet, after this device sank with its ship, the trail seems to vanish. For more than 1,000 years, nothing comparable appears in the historical record. Later scholars, including those involved directly in the modern investigation, have been careful not to exaggerate its significance. The mechanism does not suggest lost civilizations or impossible technology. What it suggests is something quieter and harder to account for. That advanced mechanical knowledge existed, that it was rare, and that it was fragile. The Antikythera Mechanism does not contradict history so much as it exposes its gaps. It shows what was possible, and how easily such possibilities can disappear when skills are lost, workshops close, and knowledge is no longer passed on. The device did not change the world. It sank to the sea floor, and with it went a level of understanding that would not reappear for centuries. By the time it was found again, the people who made it, used it, and understood it were long gone. What remains is a machine that should not feel out of place, and yet does. Not because it is magical, but because history does not tell us how common it once was, or how close it came to being lost forever. The Voynich Manuscript. In the early 20th century, a bookseller named Wilfrid Voynich acquired a collection of old manuscripts from a Jesuit college in Italy. Most of the books were familiar: religious texts, commentaries, volumes that had passed through many hands and left traces of use, annotations, corrections, ownership marks. One book stood apart. It was modest in size, bound in plain vellum, no title on the cover, no author's name, no date. When Voynich opened it, the pages were filled edge to edge with writing. The ink was dark and steady. The hand was careful and consistent, as though written by someone trained and unhurried. The script was unfamiliar. The letters repeated. Words appeared again and again, in slightly altered forms. Lines were evenly spaced. Margins were clean. Whatever this was, it had been written deliberately. It looked like a real book, written in a real language. But no one could read it. As Voynich turned the pages, illustrations began to appear. There were drawings of plants, each one carefully outlined and colored. Roots, stems, leaves, but none of the plants matched any known species exactly. They looked almost familiar, close enough to suggest intention, not close enough to identify. Other pages showed circular diagrams, stars, suns, moons, rings of symbols arranged around central figures. Zodiac signs appeared, but altered, as if copied imperfectly or reimagined. Then there were pages that were harder to place. Small human figures, mostly female, nude, standing or bathing in green pools connected by narrow channels. Pipes or conduits seemed to run between them. The scenes felt anatomical, but not in any recognized medical style. The book appeared to be divided into sections, each with its own visual language: a herbal section, an astronomical section, a biological or anatomical section, a final portion filled almost entirely with text. It had structure. It had intention. Voynich showed the manuscript to scholars across Europe. No one recognized the script. It was not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not Arabic, not any known medieval shorthand. Some believed it must be a cipher. That assumption made sense. Medieval Europe was full of coded writing, diplomatic ciphers, alchemical symbols, private scripts. Perhaps the key had simply been lost. The manuscript was examined more closely. The parchment was genuine. Later testing would date it to the early 15th century. The ink was consistent with the period. There was no sign of modern interference. This was not a modern forgery. The text itself was analyzed next. Linguists and cryptographers noticed something strange. The distribution of words followed patterns seen in natural languages. Certain words appeared at the beginning of lines, others clustered in predictable ways. This was not random scribbling. And yet, no translation emerged. Over the decades, the manuscript passed through institutions and into public view. It was studied by historians, linguists, and professional codebreakers. During the 20th century, some of the most experienced cryptographers in the world examined it, people who had broken military codes under wartime pressure. They failed. Later, computers were used to analyze the text. Statistical patterns were mapped. Repetition and structure were confirmed again and again. But meaning never followed. Some researchers suggested the manuscript encoded a real language, using an unknown system. Others argued it was a constructed language, invented by its author. A few proposed it was an elaborate hoax, a book designed to look meaningful without meaning anything at all. Each explanation solved one problem and created another. A hoax would have required extraordinary discipline and consistency across hundreds of pages, with no obvious slip or payoff. But if it recorded real knowledge, it was strange that no trace of that knowledge appeared anywhere else. The manuscript referenced no known place, no identifiable person, no historical event. It stood alone. Modern researchers have been cautious, careful, restrained. Studies confirm that the manuscript is medieval, that it was written by a human hand, that the text follows internal rules too consistently to be meaningless noise. And still, no explanation accounts for everything. If it is a cipher, the key has vanished without leaving a trace. If it is a language, it has no relatives. If it is a compendium of knowledge, its symbols do not align cleanly with any known tradition. What remains is a book that looks as though it should be readable. A book written carefully, patiently, as if the author expected someone, someday, to understand it. It has no introduction that explains itself, no conclusion that resolves anything, no marginal notes, no corrections. Page after page, the text continues, uninterrupted. And centuries later, it still cannot be read.